Welcome back to another episode of the Casey Campbell podcast. Casey Campbell with you, of course, and we are always pleased to be joined by my special guest, the legendary Brock Beard, of course, from NASCAR Films, of course, getting ready for his episode 6 of Rise of the Field Fillers. But before we get to that, Brock, of course, thank you for coming on once again.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so you and NASCAR Man were working on this IndyCar split documentary. I know NASCAR Man has been tremendously working on this project about a very, very important, but and also a very tough time, a dark time for IndyCar and open wheel racing overall. What was it? I know we kind of talked about it the last time you were on, but what was it like being part of the project now that all 4 episodes are out there?
It was really a tremendous experience. For me personally, I don't really have a tremendous amount of backing or background in IndyCar racing, besides maybe the last decade or so. I think really more my interest in the sport has really built since the reunification. But I've certainly been familiar with hearing about the split before and how damaging it was to the sport, how certain competitors were never able to run in the Indy 500. And a tremendously controversial thing that I'm sure NASCAR has watched very closely as well, to make sure their sport doesn't split up in a similar manner. It was really interesting to find out, especially in the early days of the split, like the very bizarre personalities that filled the IRL, and kind of some overlap even with the rise of the field fillers to a degree. But overall, again, tremendous shout out to NASCAR Man History there for the tremendous script that he was able to put together. Really breaking down at times a very complicated issue. A lot of politics involved, a lot of controversy, a lot of pretty angry words from both sides, not just the fans, but even the officials and the drivers. Very contentious period in the history, but I like the way that NASCAR Man approached it, where he broke it down to multiple parts, really tried to delve into each aspect of it. And, I saw there were people in the comments wondering if they would stretch it even further into something else. But I like the way that he set it up there, where, especially in this last episode, you can see the swing from the peak of the CART IRL split to the present day. I think it fits much better in the way that he set it up. So just happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, there was so much, we're on there, and some of it kind of relates into NASCAR because, for a couple times in NASCAR's history, I know, there was a series war of CART, and that NASCAR kind of had something similar to that in the mid 90s with the tire wars a little bit. I don't know how much you remember that or read into that or learned about that, but what was that like? With the Hoosier tires coming in there, I know Slap Shoes has kind of documented this as well. But what was that like, to have a tire war like that with Goodyear and Hoosier?
Well, that's a good question. And also that I'd be remiss without mentioning that also, I think that was the first video I narrated for NASCAR Man. I know you mentioned Slap Shoes video. NASCAR Man made his own script on that. Right. To kind of really expand on, especially Speed Weeks 94 and its aspect of it. It was a scary time, really thinking about the big thing for me, and I think I mentioned it at the end of the NASCAR Man video, growing up, starting to follow NASCAR in 91, 92, thereabouts, my awareness of Neil Bonnett, for example, was similar to maybe fans today about Darrell Waltrip, a driver that used to be a multiple time winner and one of the big names out there. But then becoming more of a broadcaster, having to show winners. My only frame of reference of knowing about it was like, oh, he does this great show. I love the interviews that he did. And, him as a driver is something that was just kind of like, it seemed so distant in the past. It wasn't really, during my time, even though it really wasn't. It was just a matter of a couple of years before he had the wreck at Darlington. But then to hear about him coming back out and trying to make a few races in 94, the Brickyard 400 was coming up that year. So that was a big story. And you had a lot of teams coming in there. And then you throw this tire issue on top of it there. I think there was a lot of anticipation coming into that 94 season. And tragically, the deaths of Neil Bonnett and Rodney Orr were, absolutely catastrophic there. I mean, it cast a huge pall over the 500 there. I think it really kind of set the whole season really on the wrong foot. And then, of course, Ernie Irvan's accident later that year. And the strangest thing about it is I'd always grown up believing that it was really the tires that were kind of central to Rodney Orr and Neil Bonnett's accidents. It seems like there have been later investigations pointing to a common suspension part issue on both cars that led to it. It's unfortunate both of them happened to have Hoosier tires, so that kind of really made that tire controversy even greater. But as you've seen in both videos that have been featured on there, the even bigger controversy with Hoosier was just the fact that, they were just coming apart, that Goodyear was starting to make faster tires that were also unreliable. And much like in the late 80s in the first round of the tire war, you had a real tense time. There's some parts of 94 that I look back on very fondly. Again, the big teams coming in, a lot of number of teams, Harry Gant's retirement season, the first Brickyard 400, but there was always this very clear haze over it, and not just the tragedies at Daytona, and then the ongoing controversies with the tire war. It was a bizarre time. It's really hard to think about it in retrospect, or to kind of put today in that same time period and to make it understandable. But I think that's why it's great that there's been now a couple of videos talking about it, because it's an important time that needs to be remembered.
Yeah. I know you kind of going back to, the questions kind of seem like Neil Bonnet, of course, he drove for James Finch during that time. You got to talk to James Finch for one of the earlier episodes of Phoenix Racing. What was that like, to profile that kind of team? Because I know that, during that time, I know James was trying to get into NASCAR, of course, coming from construction and all that. What was that like to, get a chance to talk to him and be, have him featured in one of the earlier episodes that you did?
It was very interesting because he seemed to indicate that Neil Bonnet was just a really good friend of his. I don't know how far back exactly they went. It sounded like it maybe even gone further back to back in the times on the short tracks and when he met Jeff Purvis and everything too. Finch, I mean, there's I think, of all the episodes that I've done on the rise of the field fillers, I feel like that one's maybe one where I didn't really fully do it justice. Because I guess Morgan Shepherd's is kind of like that too. Just a personality where there's so many stories and so many points of contact he's had in his career. You would probably take a 10-hour video just to, really kind of at least touch on every aspect of it. But the Neil Bonnet thing was certainly, certainly a part of it. But yeah, I mean, and the fact that, he was good friends, with Neil Bonnet. I think what that really kind of focuses on is even more on Bonnett himself, because I just finished listening to the Scene Vault podcast interview with Butch Mock, and he mentioned Mock mentioned Neil Bonnett in the same way, that they were just good friends. They went really far back, and I think that it just really speaks to just how friendly Neil Bonnett was, and how loyal he was to a lot of these team owners for multiple years. James, yeah, very interesting personality. I mean, countless stories to certainly talk about with his team, and other drivers that featured in the field fillers like Joe Ruttman and stuff coming in there. I had a few comments, on that video where people were wondering why this team is getting mentioned in the same breath as a lot of these other field filler teams, because it doesn't seem to really fit the bill, since they won with Brad Keselowski. Since they were very good at the super speedways and stayed in the sport as long as they did. But again, it's the fact that they dabbled in having to do the start and park thing and try to stretch limited rate race refund funding into a full season fund. Germain Racing did that years later. You mentioned 2009. That would be kind of an example of that. It fits right in, and they were lumped into the same controversies over the field fillers that these other teams we've talked about were in that respect. So I think really, long answer short to your question, I think it's just there's a lot of layers to it, and it's really hard to kind of get your hands around any one of these stories. But it's very clear that Neil Bonnet and James Finch, much like with Butch Mock, go very far back.
You mentioned, I know James Finch. Doing like, overall what he has meant to, with his team and all that. What was it like just, talking to him and, learning about that? Was that the first time you ever got a chance to talk with James?
Yep. First time. I never had the good fortune to meet with him at a racetrack. He never even the closest I would have been able to come to speaking with him is his team ever running at my local track here at Sonoma. He didn't enter a car there until I think 2009 or 2010. So it was definitely a new experience there, but it was just a matter of calling him up, and I got their administrator up front at Phoenix Construction, and she got me right in with him, and we just went ahead and talked on my way to work that morning. So very friendly guy, always eager, a great student of the sport too. He's kept all these stories very close to his heart and very eager to share them, and made for a great interview. And I hope that came across in the episode.
Yeah, of course. Of course, the I know episode 6. I know you've been talking about that. I know you're in the works with that one. This is going to be a really interesting one, because I know that the Morgan Shepherd one that you did obviously has been one of the best so far. I mean,
Thank
getting
you.
a chance to talk to Morgan and stuff. But this one I think is going to be really interesting, because you're going to profile a team, and that a lot of people might not remember, the Hoover Team. So it's definitely going to be there. What was it like? Of course, running the 80 car. What was that like to profile that team?
This was really interesting, and I've deliberately, I know it's been kind of a long wait. I think the Shepherd episode came out right before the season started.
Yeah.
So a little bit of that has just been getting back into the rhythm of my regular weekly coverage. But I really wanted to kind of take my time on this one, because it is an unusual story. Because like you said, it's a team that doesn't really get talked about that much. We talked about before the show about how even the proper pronunciation of the team owner's name was something that I wasn't aware of until I interviewed the guy. That I always thought it was Stan Hoover, just like everybody else did. And even Mike Joy said in old starting grids back in the 90s. But he corrected me and said, no, it's Stan Hoover, even though it's just the 1-0. And I think that really goes to show just how obscure this team is, and which is saying something, given that we've talked about Don Arnold's team, we've talked about James Finch, and we've talked about Morgan Shepherd's team, Kirk Shelmerdine's team. I mean, other programs that were like that. But it's been challenging. I think it's in a way, in some ways, it's been a little bit more dense than I think last episodes. So it's a matter of kind of spreading that out a little bit. But I think it's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to make connections with other events in the sport's recent history that maybe make a little bit more sense when you're aware more about this team. Because it turns out this team is quite the pedigree that I think I didn't really even fully realize, and I'm sure the viewers are going to be very interested to find out.
I mean, we look at with what in doing this project. I know we kind of talked about this, before when we had you on a few weeks ago. What was it like, to tell the stories of these guys, of the field fillers and all that?
It's been a real enjoyable experience. I mean, I think I mentioned it on your last show here, that this was originally going to be my next book after the JD McDuffie book. And the more I was laying out the facts, the more I was doing the research, I couldn't really approach it in the same chronological way that I did with the JD book, or in as clear of a way, and it also felt more and more like I was writing a book just for my own entertainment rather than something that would have a wide audience. I have no doubt that you would enjoy it from our conversations here, but I'm not sure if it would have been something a publisher would have been all that excited about. But then I really thought, it's a lot of this is video content. A lot of it's from not all that long ago in NASCAR history. At least it feels that way to me. But a lot of content that is, I think, shows better in video format than a book anyway. So I think this is a better way to approach it. But the way the overall theme of it, though, is like, this is what I feel I would have done if I started the NASCAR website in 2004 instead of 2009. This is what I would have been talking about back then, is tracking these teams like Kirk Shelmerdine's team and like these others. I remember, going to message boards. I mean, kids, people probably don't even go to message boards anymore or anything, but there were, all kinds of different, general interest message boards, and always sharing all these pictures of these field filler cars out there. It's like, isn't this interesting? This guy's in the Cup Series and doesn't even have a sponsor. And everybody's just, yeah. I wasn't really, I was trying to get other people interested in it because I was really interested in it. So it's kind of my effort to kind of go back in time and really catch this, and also try to bring the YouTube channel more in line with the NASCAR website to give these teams more attention, because that's really the ultimate goal of both of these, is to really shed some new light on them. I mean, I love seeing people share pictures of like making sim racing paint schemes of these cars and stuff like that. That's great. That's the kind of stuff that I love to see, and hopefully we'll have some more content for that too.
So I know that, when NASCAR fans, when I was watching NASCAR in 2004, because the thing is, what I notice is that when you recognize like a car and and a sponsor, you immediately know who's in that car. There's a couple iconic things that, I took away from that, that season. One of them was like, there are two cars kind of really stood out to me. Was the Dale Jarrett UPS, when Dale Jarrett had the UPS sponsorship from like 2001 to like 2008. And then there was the Ricky Craven Tide machine. Though, I mean, having that, going back to Jared for a second, when he partnered with UPS, what was that time like? Because it also created a lot of like recognizable brands and stuff, but it also, put some pretty good commercials and entertainment on there.
Oh, absolutely. UPS, I mean, I would say, especially since, as you mentioned, that they coincided it with Fox and NBC's new TV contract in 2001, where they came on board. They jumped into the sport with both feet, and they did that race truck promotion, like you're mentioning in the commercials. Real entertaining stuff. I think his paint scheme, by the time we got to 2004, they kind of made the paint scheme a little bit more head turning. It back in the first couple seasons, I thought it looked pretty drab, considering that his quality care paint scheme was always the one that I identified him with from 1996 through 2000. And it was kind of a shame to see that go away, because to me, that was like one of the iconic paint jobs. I wasn't a huge Dale Jarrett fan growing up. I along with Jerry Nadeau, who I did the feature on the channel, I rooted more for his teammate Ricky Rudd, and would love to see the 28 car, return to prominence as it had with Davey Allison and Ernie Irvan. But with Jarrett, though, he was always tough, and that was really the peak of his career between like 2001, 2002, thereabouts. Those first couple of years in the UPS car. And good memories of it, though. I mean, he still won at Darlington in Texas and some really difficult tracks, just like he had the decade previous. And he was a tough guy out there. And you mentioned the Tide ride too with Ricky Craven. I mean, we saw Eric Jones run the Tide car at Bristol this week. Brought all kinds of memories back to that time period when you see that orange and white car out there, and you knew in an instant that was whoever that driver was, whether it was Ricky Craven or Darrell Waltrip or Ricky Rudd or Scott Pruitt or Bobby Hamilton Jr. or whoever was in there, you knew it was that team or driver or whatever combination of it.
Also in 2004, there was also Terry Labonte's last full-time season in the Cup Series, because because the thing is, his career is so interesting, because in winning the championship and just being so consistent, getting it done at some of the big tracks and big places and stuff. What was it like? And when the Kellogg's car came about, you kind of started to struggle those last few years, and then you never know when he could come up and do it. And I think 2003 was that with the Southern 500 and stuff. What was it like, watching Terry in those last few years, and kind of culminating with this 2004 thing? It's kind of like one of the biggest like things that's overshadowed. It was his last season. I know he didn't have the best season, but with everything that happened with the first year of the chase, and then obviously with the Hendrick plane crash, it was one of the things that was kind of to me, it was a little bit like went under the radar a little bit.
I mean, Terry Labonte, has always been the very soft-spoken, kind of driver that, didn't draw a lot of attention, to himself, but was an absolutely outstanding driver. I mean, I mentioned Ricky Rudd earlier. I kind of put him in the same category. When Ricky Rudd's career, when he was drawing his career to the end for the first time in 2005, his crew chief had an outburst at the Homestead drivers meeting saying, look, I mean, this guy's running his last race. Is anybody going to like say anything about it? But Rick Rudd was so quiet that, he didn't, really draw a lot of attention to it. And he did end up coming back in 2007. Terry Labonte was a lot the same way, only Labonte ended up staying in part-time for so long that his brother ended up taking over his ride at Go Fast Racing those years later. Terry Labonte was, I think I touched on this a little bit in my video on retirement seasons. I think that early 2000s time period, I guess between 2000, probably between like 2004, really, yeah, at that starting point, 2000, maybe 2003 to 2004 into 2007 to 2008, there was a tremendous overhaul in the field. And you saw a lot of big names that I grew up with retire, and we're just suddenly just not there anymore. And you would put Terry Labonte and Ricky Rudd and Rusty Wallace and Dale Jarrett and those competitors in there, and you had all these other newcomers come in there, your Dale Juniors, your Matt Kenseths, your Tony Stewart, and so forth. And it was, and pretty soon when you got to like 2006, 2007, the sport was completely different than it had been not even a decade earlier. And that was a huge, I think that was, and it was sad in a lot of ways, really. I mean, because I think in a lot of, I mean, some cases you had drivers that did retirement tours like Richard Petty did, Mark Martin, and then in his first attempt to retire in 2005, and Rusty Wallace in his last call tour come to mind with that. And then others like Terry Labonte that kind of did a retirement tour and then, kept coming back. I think, it was sad to, it was nice in some cases that they didn't immediately disappear. I draw comparisons to 1988, where you had a whole lot of drivers retire. This kind of brings back to our discussion on the tire wars back then. Blown tires, pretty much, I mean, ended Buddy Baker's career that year. He did a few starts after 88, but nothing more full-time after that. Bobby Allison's accident at Pocono. Richard Petty very nearly ended his career after the big wreck at Daytona. Cale Yarborough retired at the end of the year. Dale Jarrett actually taking over his ride back then. It was similar to that in some ways, but in other ways we had, kind of a difference there too. So, and it was challenging because I think unlike that time in 88, where a lot of these talents took a little while to kind of get their feet under them. By the time we got to 2004 to 2003 to 2008, these kids were winning like right out the box. Tony Stewart and Jeff Gordon changed the paradigm so much that it was surprising when these guys wouldn't win. And you had guys like, I mean, to think that Ryan Newman beat Jimmy Johnson for Rookie of the Year just on consistency alone, even though he didn't win as many races, just shows how top the talent was. And that was 2002. So it was a weird time. It was a very weird time. And I think there was some good out of that. And unfortunately, when, the nostalgia hits, some of it wasn't as fun, but it's just a part of the sport, just like any other sport.
One more thing I want to ask you is, with kind of like going back to retirement seasons, I know the most kind of like the first one to really, I know there were more, but the one that I remember, and I wasn't even around for this one, but Richard Petty in 1992, when the Fan Appreciation Tour, I think the day 1992 Hooters 500, I think kind of documented this a little bit, but I don't know how much you documented and looked at this season, but why do you think Richard Petty ran so long? And why do you think drivers are maybe retiring to maybe too soon or something?
That's a good question. I think that does kind of tag on to what we were talking about the way that one group of retirements in one decade felt very different from the recent ones here. Certainly there's differences to look at in terms of, health concerns, concussions, of course, being top of the list. I mean, you look at Dale Jr., you look at, there's theories going around about why Jimmy Johnson retired when he did and why his performance dropped off. But that may have had something to do with it too. It is just a very different sport now and different to play out. But with Richard Petty, I think he just enjoyed doing it. I think that at the end of the day, even though he was far more successful than really any other driver out there, regardless of their backing, the thing that's, I think, that's easy to forget with Richard Petty is, at the end of the day, he was another owner driver. He was, one of the, it was a family run organization. Of course, it started with his father, Lee, and, that they had grown the program, well beyond that by 1992. But there's a lot of JD McDuffie in them, or Dave Marcus, or James Hilton, or any of these other guys that also had very, very long careers. And and Richard, I think, and he would probably downplay that himself, because he's always been, again, kind of like Terry Labonte, very mild mannered, very quiet, very humble, very, very much, as any, I think, true champion should be. I mean, there's a bit of that even in Jimmy Johnson as well. But I think that at the end of the day, he had no reason to quit. I mean, even after the wreck in 1988 at Daytona, the fact that he just kind of just kept going, during that entire time period. And I think the way the Fan Appreciation Tour came about, and this is kind of touched on in the speed thing, he viewed this as a way to give thanks to the fans out there. Felt like, okay, this, I've had all this success, I've been able to receive so much, I want to give back. And then, the touching thing about that was that at every stop, the fans wanted to thank him for being out there for so long. And that was really a big thing. But, I had the opportunity to speak to Richard about his retirement. And, because when I was doing the research for the JD McDuffie book, I noticed that the accident that JD McDuffie was in, it was in August of 91. In October of 1991 was when Richard announced the Fan Appreciation Tour to begin with. I don't know if he would ever admit it, but my question to him was, did this have to do with that? Was your decision to ultimately retire because of JD McDuffie's accident? And he said no. He said no. He said the decision had already been made before that. Now, I should have asked the $10 million question at that point, would have been, well, when was that decision made? But I didn't think to ask that at the time. It occurred to me afterwards. I'm not even sure he would say, but I know from at least, I'm glad I at least asked him that question. So I know that it was sometime before August of 91 that he decided he was going to retire. And what brought that about, I don't know. Maybe that'd be something to ask Kyle about or something, but that would be kind of the interesting question to figure out. But I think that would probably go kind of a ways to understanding why he stayed in it as long as he did.
Yeah. So, yeah, NASCAR has all these things, and it just ties everything together into what it is today. But anyway, Brock Beard, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. There's always stuff to talk about with you with the history of NASCAR, and I always, me, I always love learning about it. And don't forget to catch episode 6 of his Rise to the Field filler series, which will be out soon.
All right, thank you very much for having me.